Hello there, fellow Warhawks. Welcome to week 2 here for Communication Conflict Resolution. I'll be your host and concierge, Michael Betker. Actually, I'm just your instructor. We're going to talk about Chapter 1 today. So first, let's talk about Thought Piece 1. This is, of course, one of 5. So we've got 5 total thought pieces here. This is the first one. And what I'm asking you to do here in this case here is to write a thoughtful analysis of what you've learned about conflict from your parents. Now, we all kind of agree, and we're going to talk about that today, too, how much parents influence, our style and the way we kind of look at conflict. So here are some things I'd like you to think about, obviously, and write about. Again, 500 to 600 words is really ends up usually being 2 pages, roughly, give or take. Double spaced, it's about a page and a half, roughly, give or take. So some things you want to include in your response, and this is, by the way, a submission, so you want to type it out onto a Word document and submit this to Canvas. So what did you learn from your parents, conflict-wise? And what you've learned about conflict from other family members. So maybe you've got a brother or a sister or somebody else who kind of demonstrated some behaviors that you kind of latched onto. The positive things you've learned from these folks, of course, and also the negative things you've learned from them as well. And it'll be fun to do this and maybe cathartic for you guys as well. So that's Thought Piece 1, 40 points. Let me know if you have any questions on that, but that should be pretty straightforward. Okay, so here we are. Chapter 1, Conflict in Our Lives. Let's kick things off. So here's what we're going to learn in this course here, all right? We're going to learn about popular attitudes and myths about conflict, because there's a lot of them out there. We're also going to strive to, through the literature on conflict, to define conflict. And we'll take you through kind of the odyssey of how it started all the way through to what we think about conflict today from a definition standpoint. We're also going to identify conflict management skills, some things that you do to manage conflict. And of course, last but not least, we're going to talk about listening skills and how they relate to conflict management. So here's the thing I'd like you to do. I'd like you actually to, I want to have you guys do this exercise quickly. So I would like you to stop the video, just click pause for a second. But I want you to take a few minutes and jot down a list of words that you believe relate to the word conflict. Okay? So jot down as many as you can. Just think about it quickly, and then think about what pops in your head, the first thing you think about when you think about conflict. And we'll catch you on the other side here. Okay, welcome back. So I hope you guys got a good list there. Let's try this. So let me ask you this. Did your list contain words like argue, hostility, disagreement, draining, fight, stressful, upsetting, anxiety, or any other term that might be considered a little bit negative? If you did, any one of those words, I'd like you to put a -1 next to, okay? Now, conversely, your list includes words like creativity, or energizing, or progress, or opportunity, or growth, or innovation, or proactive, or anything that's more positively related. I'd like you to add a plus. So add those all together. What did you come up with? Was your number positive or was it negative? If it's negative, that means obviously you're going to prove me right and prove the book right that most folks have these misconceptions about what conflict really is. So, and if you've got a positive number based on your list, that's good. You guys are starting to think about this the right way. So some popular attitudes about conflict, and you probably have this as evidence in your list. First thing is, most people think negatively about conflict, right? It makes you feel uneasy, maybe your palms sweat a little bit if you think about a conflict you've had and a person you just don't get along with very well. Very few people, so don't feel bad, very few people relate conflict in positive ways or with positive feelings. The way we feel and understand conflict may influence the way we deal with conflict when it occurs. So in other words, you have default patterns, right? So if you've been socialized and you're brought up to handle conflict a certain way or to fear conflict, as many are, you're going to have this sort of response where you may avoid conflict altogether. Or maybe you're the opposite. Maybe you're the kind of person who really wants to get after, like this guy here is punching this person in the nose. Maybe that's the way you handle conflict. Now, just to give you a quick story, my mother was that way. She was more, not the punch in the face kind of person, but she was the kind of person to not let things go in social places. So that embarrassed me infinitely when I was a kid growing up. So that always kind of turned me off. That's one of the things I had to unlearn. Conflict can be productive and can lead to social change. That's one thing the book talks about at length. And the last point here is conflict takes place in different contexts in our lives, as we mentioned. All right, some myths. We're going to kind of quickly go through some of the myths about conflict here. The picture on the right there obviously is the Civil War kind of reference. Essentially, the Civil War was the deadliest war in American history, right? 210,000 soldiers were killed in action, and according to Wikipedia, 625,000 total died. People died in that conflict. So It's no wonder why people think negatively about conflict. I mean, it just really kind of often has bad results, and people often die in these serious conflicts. So it's understandable as to why people might hold these negative connotations about conflict. There are several myths. They are negative and they do not correspond to reality. So we're going to kind of break those down here in this chapter. Popular negative myths about conflict also reveal that conflict and conflict resolution are not well understood. So that's one of the great reasons why you guys are here in this class. You're going to learn a lot about some of the myths, and let's talk about those. All right, first and foremost, conflict is always bad, right? So in every case, you should avoid conflict. The reality is conflict can be positive in many cases, right? Now, obviously, any war that leads to just death upon death upon death without any end game is not what I would consider a good conflict. However, I would say that if you look at World War II, was that an end, was that final conflict? Did that result in good things? And you could probably make the argument that it did. The next myth: harmony is normal, conflict is abnormal. So in other words, the idea that we should always just hug each other and be happy and never have a conflict. The reality is conflicts are inevitable, and conflicts in relationships are as normal as is harmony. Both are normal in relationships. And in fact, you're going to see in this upcoming slides here, you're going to see that academics came to that realization that both are necessary for healthy relationships. The next myth: conflicts destroy relationships. In other words, you have too much conflict, it's a bad thing. Well, actually, if you know this, if people don't have conflict at all, a lot of times that is indicating that there's bigger problems with the relationship. In fact, I had friends recently who got divorced, and they never fought. And it was kind of odd. We always thought that was weird that they never fought together, but ultimately their relationship terminated as a result. So the reality is conflict can strengthen a relationship when handled appropriately. Another myth: the best way to resolve a conflict is simply to compromise. Okay, so we'll talk about compromise in class and in upcoming lectures, but essentially compromise means, all right, you give a little, I give a little, we both get something, right? That's a good way to do it, right? But it's not the best way. I would say a win-win requires, there's a way to think about a conflict that could potentially result in both parties getting 100% of what they want. It just takes a little extra work. The myth, next myth: in families, as long as the children don't see their parents fight, they are not affected by conflict, right? Well, reality of that is, and I can tell you I come from a family who had some conflict. My parents got divorced. I'm sure some of you guys have that same story here, but families are a system made up of parts. If one part of the system is having difficulties, the difficulties affect everybody, right? And that's kind of how it works in a family. So if you think you're being private about a conflict, it's not the case more often than not. So essentially the key takeaway here is that conflict and conflict resolution are not well understood by most people. So don't feel bad if your list did not contain a lot of these positive terms here for conflict. It's something we all think about. So we're going to unlearn that and relearn it. We talked about popular attitudes about conflict, and I want to kind of now talk specifically about childhood learning related to conflict. A couple facts the book points out here, and this picture obviously is a great one. I think it shows a son, obviously I'm assuming that's the son of the man there who's a soldier. I don't know where this might be. It reminds me of Serbia potentially, but either way, you got a lot of kids growing up in this kind of environment where every day is very stressful, and there's often shootings. And even in this country, you've got city centers where shootings happen on a regular basis. If you look at Milwaukee, Bullet City, per capita, more people die from gunshot wounds than almost anywhere in the country. So you got a lot of kids growing up in this environment, right? So they learn to handle conflict from their parents and peers. Children also use the learned conflict style inside the family as well as outside the family. So I'll give you a quick another story. Like, I adopted some of the strategies my mother used to employ, and it was the hard-nosed, my way or the highway approach to conflict that I had to unlearn early in my career. That caused me some problems just having that attitude. So I've unlearned that and kind of fashioned my own approach based on my own learnings. Our first experiences indicate the most powerful party determines the outcome of the conflict. Again, use my mother as an example. She was the most powerful person, obviously. And so she was always the one who kind of determined the outcome of a conflict. And theorists have proposed that peer relationships shape our behavior, and that the use of specific conflict ending strategies are a product of maturity. So over time, actually, we start figuring things out a little bit more. And as a college person and beyond, obviously, we're here to kind of educate ourselves, and we can change and grow. Ultimately, children often do not have opportunities to learn creative forms of dealing with conflict unless their parents, of course, are focused on that. So It really is. It does start at a very young age. All right, moving on here. So conflict generally can lead to change. So it seems like in the moment when we're having a big conflict, and there's a lot of trials and tribulations toward a goal. For example, here in the upper left corner, you see you have women's liberation movement, which has gone through a lot of ups and downs over the years, and obviously still going through turns even today with regard to pay. And you'll see this in an upcoming thought piece where I'll ask you to think about equal pay as a way of writing a thought piece. So, but yeah, note that that's the case, right? And obviously, we've seen a lot of growth and improvement in the women's liberation movement over the years, but not without a lot of strife and struggle. Same thing's true, obviously, more recently you've seen this, the same-sex marriage movement and the ability for people to have the same rights that opposite-sex couples have. And at the bottom there, of course, the big one that I would think about often when I think about these big conflicts would be segregation as well, and the idea that, people are people, and the color of your skin should not dictate where you go to the bathroom or which restaurant you eat in, et cetera, et cetera. So our history has shown that we've been through a lot of these types of things. So it does lead to positive change if you've got a goal in mind. So like I mentioned in the first video, the study of conflict is recent. It's not until recently that there has been a lot of agreement on the meaning of concepts of these theories. So you're going to see this people started out in different kind of camps and different ways of thinking about it. A guy by the name of Simmel coined the term association, which always involves harmony and conflict together, right? So that's the basis of his theory, that he has absorbed that. It used to be people think, conflict's bad, and the only thing you need is harmony, right? Well, he actually came to the realization, and it was a big breakthrough, that harmony and conflict together can be positive. They work together, like two peas in a pod. He also mentioned that a group without conflict could not exist. So in other words, if you're sitting in a room with a person, you never fight with that person, there's no way you can grow or develop or change. So it's really not possible to not have some conflict. Last point there, research in communication of the past 4 decades centers around the issue of communication shaping conflict issues and outcomes. That's why, really frankly, why we have this class in the communication department. Here are a few points I'd like you to kind of make note of that constitute what is a conflict versus not a conflict. So you want to take this into account because some of the quizzes and tests coming up will ask you questions about what conflict. I'll give you some case studies and or examples, and you'll have to say is it a conflict or not a conflict. So it's important to pay attention here. First thing you got to show is an expressed struggle, right? Behaviors associated with relationships are conflict behaviors. So it's got to be an expressed struggle. It can't be something you're just mad about and you're not talking about to anybody, right? Interdependence, that's the second point, right? There must be a mutual interest between the parties and some dependence upon one another. So in other words, there's got to be a relationship of some kind or interdependence. Perceived incompatible goals, right? So parties in a conflict want the same thing, but they want different goals for that same thing. So in other words, you have a difference of opinion about what the goals should be. Number 4 is a big one, perceived scarce resources, right? So in other words, if one party thinks that they're being maligned in some fashion, that reduces their overall well-being or resources, that's really a part of it. That's a part of how you can define conflict. And resources can be tangible or intangible. It can be related to power, or it could be maybe property-based. There's a number of ways to think about that. Last but not least, there's got to be interference of some kind. In other words, actual or perceived interference is necessary for conflict. So in other words, somebody actually going in and doing something to another or party. Either way, there's got to be that. And even if it's perceived, then that can lead to conflict. But either way, there's got to be some kind of interference. Conflict that has all the components is a realistic conflict, all right? A disagreement may not necessarily be a conflict, but conflict may derive from a disagreement. So you can have an argument with somebody that can be resolved within that conversation, but it's not a conflict necessarily. Conflict means that there's a long-standing sort of ongoing interaction that is negative and results in bad things happening. Here's a couple examples. Debates usually include disagreements, but they are not conflict. Conflict has to transcend thoughts and become an expressed behavior. So that's what we're talking about here. Another example, thinking only of obtaining somebody's goods does not make it a conflict. There needs to be an action or behavior. So again, just thinking about, like, say, for example, you have issues with our current president, some of us do, but you don't necessarily technically have a direct conflict with Donald J. Trump, but you're thinking about it, but obviously it's not a conflict. Second big bullet point there, for the interaction to be considered conflict, it must take place in a relationship. All right, so you've got to have It takes two to tango, right? So you got to have that. Remember that it takes two to tango. One example here: a student opposition to Russia's intervention in Ukraine does not meet the elements of the conflict definition, since said student does not have a actual relationship with the leader of that country. So again, you got to have that kind of interaction. You got to have, basically like a two-way flow of communication at least. All right, so as we've talked about now, we know this. Conflict is inevitable. It's actually not a bad thing when handled appropriately. So this here, Koser is another person actually who kind of took the ball and moved it further along regarding conflict. His basic prepositions about conflict, and I'll just kind of go through these here. Relationships are, of course, made of attraction and conflict. So at the base level, we have these relationships with people, and either you like a person, or a lot of times when you walk into a room and you just know and someone doesn't care for you, that can lead to conflict. Conflict is necessary to maintain a relationship. So in other words, we've talked about this. You can't have a relationship where there's no conflict. In fact, most relationships, in fact, all relationships will fail if there's not any kind of healthy discussion or conflict. Absence of conflict does not mean a strong or stable relationship toward that end. And conflicts in close relationships are likely to be intense, right? So, to give an example of my family, my wife and I have disagreements and arguments all the time. Even my kids now get involved, and we manage to part ways in a positive way. So it's never left in a bad way, but it is healthy and actually helps us kind of arrive at solutions as a family. Last bullet point there: conflict establishes more broadly and maintains identity and boundaries of societies and groups. So it scales up and down from interpersonal to all the way up to what happens between countries. All right, so the scene back here, I don't know if you can see this, but this is an episode of Judge Wapner, or maybe Judge Judy, but either way, you've got settling things in a court here. But I want to talk about this, the difference between conflict resolution and conflict management. Now, this course is entitled Communication Conflict Resolution, right? So essentially, resolution means what? It means to finishing the conflict and putting an end, putting a bow on it, and putting it on the shelf and forgetting about it, right? Well, most often that is not a reality, right? In no greater place has this disparity been found than in culturally, right? So, for example, in China, conflict and negotiation are understood as an ongoing process, and other countries as well. So the term conflict management indicates there can be possible outcomes to conflict. For example, here, a couple's conflict over who gets custody of the children does not mean one of the parents will not have any part in raising them if the conflict is ended. So in other words, it's ongoing, right? There's going to be continued need for managing that conflict as things move forward. Morton Deutsch, also a pioneer in conflict resolution studies. So essentially he came up with two concepts here, and they're known as constructive conflict and destructive conflict. All right, so constructive conflict is just what it sounds like. It encourages productivity and cohesion and invokes change. So it's just, it sounds antithetical, like constructive conflict. It's a positive word, a negative word, but actually it does make sense if you believe that conflict can lead to positive change. Conversely, destructive conflict, we see this in the news all the time, and it often ends up with a gunshot of some kind. And almost daily you hear about people getting shot in Milwaukee or Chicago or big cities across the country. So destructive conflict is where disputants lose the sight of their goals and focus rather on hurting and annihilating each other. So that's really, obviously not, it's something to be avoided. All right, let's talk about something completely different now, something called the Janus groupthink theory, one of my favorite theories when I was in grad school here. I loved this idea. And I actually kind of have been looking to spot it ever since I learned about groupthink. And I have seen it in some organizations I worked in, of course, also on the national stage, and a lot of times you see it in politics. But groupthink essentially is this. It's nothing more than setting aside critical discussion and maybe even conflict in favor of preserving cohesion within the group. So you see here this graphic here is showing what they really think, right? Oh my gosh, this guy's crazy, or say it ain't so, you've got to be kidding, perish the thought, heaven forbid, no, 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 1,000 times no. All those in favor say aye. So you've got people just having one thought, but actually expressing something completely different. And why? Because more than likely the leader of that group has made it very apparent that cohesion is the most important thing, or loyalty is what they've used. A lot of politicians have used that. It's been asserted that George Bush Jr. Had some of this going on in his cabinet as well. So groupthink is important. Actually, there's a couple videos tucked into this week here. I'd like you to watch those videos as well on groupthink and bone up on that. There'll be more on this. We're going to talk about this in the future as well, but I'd like you to start thinking about groupthink, and maybe you've seen some examples. Groupthink can result in dysfunctional decision making, as demonstrated in several cases. One in particular is the Space Shuttle Challenger explosion, which is a real live documented case of groupthink, where a timeline was being crunched and corners were being cut knowingly to make sure they hit their schedule, and that ultimately caused, if you don't remember, the Challenger explosion based on some faulty equipment that was placed into the Challenger itself. And of course, a horrific crash. So you'll see this in the video if you watch that. So I encourage you to watch that as well and get to learn more about groupthink. That's the other way of going, obviously, where too much cohesion can cause bad decisions in groups. All right, so conflict management skills also include listening and empathy, all right? They are essential to communication, as we know, and also in conflict. So the first stage, obviously, is listening. It's physiological, obviously. So in other words, the airwaves of a person saying something to you hit your tympanic membrane, and there's an auditory and visual stimuli that are present. At this point, obviously, no assumption must be made that people are hearing at an optimal level. So in other words, you might be passively listening, right? Like a lot of times parents tune out their little kids, right? That's one example of that. So you're not really sure if you can hear it, but you don't really listen. So there's a big difference there. Second stage is understanding, right? And that's where actually cogitation happens. The message is attended to through the short-term memory system and then interpreted for meaning. Interpreting involves assigning meaning to words and non-verbal messages. So what we attend to is limited by our perceptional filters, which is made up of our culture, past experiences, interests, attitudes, and beliefs. So in other words, we are the sum total of our experiences, and how we take in information really has a lot to do with how we were brought up. So understanding is really kind of colored by these filters. The next is remembering. This is where a lot of bad things can happen, because we do tend to remember the things we want to remember, and we forget a lot of the other stuff. We just don't possibly have the capacity to remember everything we hear. So listening depends on our ability to act sooner or later on what was received. Of course, thinking critically or evaluating, as what I would call that stage 4 there, is really listeners who make judgments about what they've heard, right? And that's, again, taking what you remember, and then, of course, a lot of times evaluating that to fit your kind of purview. Last, of course, but not least, is giving a feedback to the speaker, and of course that creates a back and forth loop, so that's communication, but the listener responds to the message and demonstrates an accurate understanding of the message. So a lot of times when I have conversations, I will repeat what people say just so they know that I picked it up correctly. It also demonstrates support for the relationship between those involved in the communication process, so stating, kind of giving feedback to the person you're talking to or group is important to that. That's chapter 1 in a nutshell. Obviously, I encourage you again to read that. Next week, we're going to tackle the second half of chapter 2, so read that first. Pages 35 to 49, I believe, so look at that. And I'll see you in the next video.